Should misogyny be made a hate crime? That's a question that's come up in recent weeks with the conviction of Wayne Couzens in the Sarah Everard case. Now, I was a little bit reluctant to make a video about that case simply because I'm always a little bit wary of particular murder cases or sensitive cases um, of being respectful to the family involved. However, it is in the public domain, it is a national story, and it has generated a lot of debate. So, with that in mind, and keeping in the vein of this channel of covering current affairs and covering these issues, um, I will be referring to that. Firstly, just about that case, I think, like many people, I was utterly horrified and disgusted with the details of what he'd done to that poor woman. It's horrible to think, particularly when she knew that she wasn't being arrested, i.e., she wasn't going to a police station because this is what Cousins used as his kind of cover, arresting her for COVID violations. When she was being driven into rural Kent, one can imagine the fear she must have felt, and that just makes it all the more loathsome and despicable what he'd done. I do think it's evil, and I think that often I condemn sentencing, but on this occasion they got it right, a whole life tariff. Um, and I think that's all Cousins deserved. I mean, what this man done was evil. It must have been harrowing for the jury to hear the testimonies from her family. Anyway, that case and the more recent case as well of the young woman who was killed in London, whose name eludes me. I haven't got notes for this video, but it these cases have once again, you know, highlighted a debate on the issue of safety of women in this country. Now, I do think it's important to be honest about the details, i.e., the statistics and facts. And statistically, the chances of a woman being kidnapped and killed in this country are still extremely low, certainly compared to Latin America, for example. Um, from that point of view, I think it's important not to scaremonger, and I think it's important that media outlets and campaigners are not reckless in their words. However, the amount of women who are harassed and experience sexual harassment is probably significantly higher than that. And I do think that whilst the criminal justice system isn't consistent in terms of sentencing of men and women, i.e., violent women often get more lenient sentences, on the other hand, too many female victims of sexual abuse don't get justice. There is a problem there, and it does vary from county to county. There's a bit of regional variation in that. But in light of the Sarah Everard case, there has been talk about making misogyny a hate crime. Well, the first thing we need to look at is what is misogyny? Well, literally, the word means hatred of women and girls. The equivalent is misandry, which is hatred of men and boys, which is not a term used as much. But that's what misogyny means, hatred of women and girls. This can be manifested in sexual crimes. This can be manifested in so-called honor crimes. It covers quite a number of things. I do feel that whenever new bills are introduced as law, it is extremely important that they are very, very clear. Now, one force, Nottinghamshire, has already introduced this as a hate crime, and I don't know what the details of that is, how exactly they determine that. But I do think it is important that this is very clearly defined because, and I can already hear feminists saying, oh, you're against misogyny being a hate crime. No, I'm not. I think it should be in terms of crime committed because of gender being a hate crime. Absolutely, it should be. However, like any new law, it must be clearly defined because if, there is a conflation between, say, a husband or a boyfriend has an argument with his wife or girlfriend, um, and maybe it gets heated, but there's no violence. Um, is he going to be charged with misogyny because he yelled at his wife or girlfriend in the heat of the moment? I mean, this has to be clearly defined. Is saying an unpleasant thing about a woman going to be classed as a misogynistic hate crime? For example, and I'm going to be verbatim about this because we need to be clear on what is, we need to look at what could, what potential scenarios it could be. So, is calling a woman a bitch going to be classed as a misogynistic crime? That's an insulting term for a woman, right? Um, but I would argue, yes, it's an insulting term, but no more so than bastard for a man. Um, I'm a little bit concerned that because of a high profile case like the Sarah Everard case, sometimes legislation could be a bit rushed for populist reasons. And the problem is when legislation gets through, it's very, very hard to overturn. This is why any new legislation needs to be scrutinised very closely. Um, it's like that hate crime bill in Scotland. Supposedly, it's supposed to replace all blasphemy laws, which have no place in the modern world. But there is significant concern that it's going to criticise it's going to silence, excuse me, legitimate criticism of Islam. I do not think that religion should have special privileges under the law in terms of being protected. Adherence, yes. So if a Muslim is attacked because they are a Muslim, that is a hate crime. But simply saying I hate Islam, Islam's a violent and intolerant religion, is provocative, but I do not consider that to be a hate crime. Freedom of expression is one of the most important things we have. It really is. And I do not believe fundamentally in criminalizing people simply for insults. Now, if you get a yob who shouts out something in the street, that's a bit different. I do think though there is a difference between people who know each other or people who I would even say that there is a difference between online insults versus antisocial behavior. I mean, clearly there are some horrible people out there who will engage in cyberbullying and say really nasty things. But there is a block button on Facebook, and I appreciate sometimes it's not that easy, especially if a public figure is bombarded with abuse. And I think some of it's disgusting. In no way would I seek to downplay that. But I do think that any new legislation really, really does need to be looked at. So when I hear misogyny should be made a hate crime, my question is, well, in what form? That's a bit like saying make hate a hate crime. No, you can't do that. You can't say if someone hates something, then it's a criminal offence to hate that thing. If it's a person, even then it becomes difficult because, there might be public figures that people hate. Should that be a hate crime to hate a public figure? Because if that's the case, I'll get in hot water for, very hated words I've said about certain public figures. I think we have to be a little bit wary. Now, having said that, with a high profile case like that, unfortunately, it takes a tragedy sometimes for change to happen. And I do think efforts need to be made to make women feel reassured. For example, in London, there has been a petition to open up the night tube. I think that's a good idea, or rather, reopen it. I guess the idea is that if women have that option of taking the tube home rather than having to walk home or get a bus, which would be more unsafe, then that's a preferable option. So something like that should be looked at for sure. I believe the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has issued a new hotline number 888 if a woman feels threatened. But then again, we have to consider, well, what existing laws are there? Now, I'm not really in favour of introducing new laws if existing laws can be utilised more. For example, we already have laws against harassment. We already have laws against sexual offences. So maybe it's just a case that they need to be enforced more. I think the Metropolitan Police in light of what happened, they need to really, really clean up their ranks. They need to improve the vetting process. I think Cressida Dick probably needs to resign because there's simply been too many scandals on her watch. This isn't the only one. Um, but I also feel that there is, to some extent, scaremongering and hyperbole going on over this. And we see a situation where people are, if they think differently in any way, shape, or form, they're accused of not being on side. An example of this is Dominic Raab. He recently addressed this at the Tory conference. He was asked questions about misogyny being a hate crime. Now, he stumbled with words a little bit, but I do think he was distorted. His words were distorted. I mean, he said insults and misogyny have no place. Then he was accused of not understanding what misogyny is, but he said insults and misogyny. He didn't say that it's one and the same thing. And of course, the problem is Dominic Raab, because of his previous comments on feminism, he's kind of a target. They would love nothing more than to expose Dominic Raab for saying something sexist. Yeah, this is a man who, if we are to believe him, he personally intervened to help a young woman. He saw her being attacked, and he personally intervened. So I don't agree with everything he's done or said, but I see this is an example. He's a prominent man, and I think some feminists are going out of their way to try and vilify him as being anti-woman, and I don't think he is at all. Um, I just think that when there's proposals for new legislation, it needs to be very, very clearly defined. Okay, misogyny is a hate crime. Does that mean that expressing misogyny is a hate crime, or rather a crime? In other words, if a man calls a woman a bitch, is he going to be arrested, even if she's insulted him as well? You know, I think if we're going to go down that line, then should misandry not also be a crime? If a woman attacks a man for being a man, should that not also be a crime? It gets back to this thing about consistency, but like the previous video I made. Consistency, consistency, consistency. Tony Blair spoke about education, education, education. I say consistency, consistency, consistency. But clearly, a large number of women don't trust the police. A large number of women do feel unsafe, and their concerns need to be taken seriously. And although statistically, what happened to Sarah Everard is very unlikely to happen to a British woman, that doesn't mean that it's not a serious problem. It doesn't mean that concerns are not valid. I do think I support efforts that will make women feel safer, absolutely. But I also feel that if there is to be new legislation, it needs to be very clearly defined because you don't want a situation where police are just interpreting this as they go along. And then you will get a situation where there is abuse of power. So that's my take. Let me know your thoughts. I base sum this up. I do support more measures to make women feel safe, but I think if this is going to go to legislation, it needs to be very, very clearly defined.